everybody knows The Great Gatsby at this point, the novel at least, although it took a while. It wasn't until a dozen to 15 years after it was written that people began to notice how good it was and that it was an American classic. Now, 90 years after it was published, it's ubiquitous. There have been 3 movies with a 4th along the way. There's been a Broadway musical. There have been various television adaptations. What is it about this piece that exerts such a hold on the imagination of people who read it or watch it or hear it?
Judging by the comments that I have heard when people have attended this piece in some form, it connects with readers mostly at what I would call a poetic point. That is, not so much the events of the story, not so much even the rather, in many ways, unlikable characters, but really some world of poetic imagination and aspiration and fantasy and delusion that these characters move in. I think all the renderings of it that follow on that novel have had to tangle with the difficulty of the various receptors of this novel wanting to stay with their own world. That novel leaves a very, very strong dialogue running between the author and the readers, and it's very individualized, very personalized. And you alluded to the slowness of its reception. I think that is also perhaps due to the elusiveness with which the story moves, that we don't have very definitive details about most of the characters. One of the things that Edmund Wilson did for it when he wrote the key article that brought it back into consciousness was come back at it really from the standpoint of the artistry of the writing, and made a tremendous case for it as a kind of almost a poetic kind of flight of imagination. I had a very unusual angle on it because Fitzgerald had never disappeared from Princeton, New Jersey, which is where I grew up. And my uncle had been in the Triangle Club with him when they were doing shows. And Fitzgerald was this side of Paradise, the early novels had made a tremendous impression, certainly on that community, because they really were located in that community. So I read it somewhat in terms of the social milieu that I knew from the town I lived in, and I was fascinated by a novelist who works with so much leverage in such a very small frame. This is part of the fascination of it. We feel like we're looking at a bunch of people we don't necessarily know much about, and whose behavior is in that way exotic.
At what point in later life did it occur to you that this would be a good subject for an opera? I remember years ago you're telling me that you felt your destiny was to be a composer of operas, and you have 3 to show for it now. But at what point did you think this would be a possibility?
Well, composer of opera, you can declare yourself a composer of opera. And then you can write operas, as I did, twice without a commission. But what you discover is that opera is more than any other concert music form, marketplace form. Composer of opera cannot declare himself a composer of opera if no one really wants to put those operas on. So after 2 operas that I had written, I had decided I must have been mistaken. And so I was working in other realms of music. And this project came up really because a few of my singer colleagues who had sung my concert songs suggested to people who had influence in an opera world that I might write another opera. So for the first time, the impulse to return to the opera field came not from my volunteer spirit, but from an interested party. And so I re-entered opera with, again, a sense that I know it's a marketplace form, but I was interested in sort of retaking my old ambition and seeing what would happen. And I also felt like the experience of the first two might be useful.